Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for our Chats on the Past program, where the museum discusses history with scholars, authors, historians, and artisans. My name is Nicole Carpenter. I'm the Director of Programs and Education at the Westport Museum for History and Culture. Thank you once again for joining us this evening. If you're just hopping in, as usual, we offer our programming free of charge. We do, as always, have a suggested donation of $5 for all of these programs, but we understand that it is still a very challenging time, but we ask that you support us however you are able. That includes following and liking us on all of our social media platforms. If you want to be notified in the future, you can follow us and like us on Facebook and Twitter at Westport History, and on Instagram at Westport History Museum. If at any point during our program you have a question, a comment, or an anecdote that you would like to share, please pop it into the comments box, and I will go through as many of those with our speaker as we have time for at the end. This evening, we are joined by Dr. Virginia Anderson. Dr. Anderson was born in Hartford, and grew up in Wethersfield, Connecticut. She received her BA from the University of Connecticut and earned her MA from the University of East Anglia in Norwich, England. On her return to the United States, she received her PhD from Harvard, and she is the author of 3 books. The first, New England's Generation, The Great Migration and the Formation of Society and Culture in the 17th Century. Creatures of Empire, How Domestic Animals Transformed Early America. And the topic that we are going to cover this evening is The Martyr and the Traitor, Nathan Hale, Moses Dunbar, and the American Revolution. The Martyr and the Traitor was named the Journal of American Revolution Book of the Year for 2017 and won the Connecticut Book Award for Nonfiction. So welcome, Virginia. Thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Well, thank you for inviting me.
Of course. So we are going to start off our program tonight with actually yesterday's date of September 10th of 1776, so quite some time ago. But we know that this date is particularly significant in Nathan Hale's story. And I wondered if you would tell our audience a bit more about Mr. Hale and how that date is significant to him.
Okay, well, I'll start with the date because it was on September 10th that George Washington, who was still trying to deal with the British takeover of New York in late August of 1776, was desperate for information about the size of the British troops, the strength, the location, and so on. And he sort of put out a call, perhaps, for somebody to go behind British lines and see what they could find out. He couldn't order anybody to do this because it was in effect asking somebody to be a spy. And spying was a kind of dishonorable activity, so he had to wait for a volunteer. And one of those volunteers, or the volunteer really, because there was only one, was Nathan Hale, who at the time was with Thomas Knowlton's Rangers, this special group of Connecticut soldiers based around New York. So that's the beginnings of Hale's mission. 12 days later, he was dead, executed on September 22nd of 1776. And, just to talk a little bit about Hale, everybody remembers him for his last moments, for that, I regret I have but one life to give for my country. And that's all they know about him, or those of us from Connecticut know he was from Connecticut. But to me, looking at his story, even though he only lived to be 21, there's sort of interesting aspects to it that I think are a useful background. I mean, he's a farmer's son from Coventry, Connecticut. He ends up going to college. He goes to Yale, which was unusual in this period, but his father had 8 sons. And if he had divided up his land among 8 sons, nobody would have gotten a farm worth farming. So Nathan Hale goes to Yale with one of his brothers. And while he's there, what seems to have been more important to him than his formal education in ancient languages and theology and so on was his involvement in something called the Linonia Society, which was a literary society that students founded among themselves because they were desperate to read the latest literature, the plays, the novels, the travel accounts of this period. And those were not part of the curriculum because the sort of stodgy faculty and administration at Yale College at this time said, those are frivolous, that's a waste of time, we shouldn't do it. So the students got together and created this literary society where, you know, once a week they'd get together in some dorm room and talk about the latest play, or they'd conduct debates, give speeches, you know, this sort of thing. And once a year they put on a play. And this experience, I think, was crucial to Nathan Hale because what these guys are trying to do is get the sort of cultural knowledge of English gentlemen down there in New Haven, Connecticut, you know, so that they could circulate in the coffee houses and parlors and be able to talk about the latest novel or play. So this is part of what I try to do in the book, is suggest that for most of his life, Nathan Hale's an Englishman, you know, English boy, English man. And that's what he's aspiring to become. While he's in this society, he makes incredibly close friends with his other club members. And when they graduate, they all miss each other. We have letters where they're writing back and forth talking about how much they miss each other. And also he graduates in 1773. So it's, you know, close to the start of the revolution. Where I see his story of Yale intersecting with the revolution, it's one of the themes of the book about how people's political decisions were shaped by personal connections. As I said, these friends are all excited about getting together again. And one of the ways they found out they could do it was by joining the army once the war began, because as college graduates, they could all immediately be commissioned as junior officers. And so if you look at Hale's class, several of his classmates and Nathan Hale end up in the army together again in the camp outside Boston when the Americans are besieging the British in Boston. And so it's not to say he didn't support the revolution, but there's this personal element of friendship that's involved in this. Also, when it comes to the spy mission, you know, he's talking this over with one of his Yale friends, which is something, you know, if you're on a secret mission, you really shouldn't be talking to your friends about it. That's part of why I think Nathan Hale didn't succeed. But he clearly is an ambitious young guy. And also at some level, it seems that he saw this spy mission as a kind of role he would be playing on a stage. And he was apparently a very good actor in the Linonian Society at Yale. And so he had this sort of confidence in his acting ability to pull off this spy mission. But as we know, he didn't. And, you know, what he's commemorated for are his admirable words at the end. But the story leading up to that, to me, is pretty interesting and doesn't lead from birth to, you know, patriot hero. It's a much more interesting and complex story than that.
That's so interesting. Those final lines, now that you say that, do sound very theatrical. In your opinion, do you think he probably said those famous lines, "I have but one life to give for my country"?
I think he said some version of them, because I could find two accounts by British officers that paraphrased it. And I don't know why two different people would say it, but it comes from this play Cato, which was by English playwright Joseph Addison. And it was the most popular play in Anglo-America. I mean, George Washington loved this. And I suspect, I can't prove it, but I suspect he read it at Yale.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. From his background, that seems to make complete sense. Yeah. Would you tell us a little bit more about his spy mission and how he is ultimately found to be loyal to the colonists?
Well, again, he volunteers to do this, and whether he comes up with this plan on his own isn't clear, but the idea is he's going to take off his uniform, dress in a plain brown suit, and go to New York. And if anybody asks him what he's doing there, he carries his Yale diploma with him. And he's going to say, oh, I'm looking for a school teaching job. And of course, after he graduates from college, before he joins the Army, he's a school teacher in New London, Connecticut. So he knows how to do this. So he apparently gets to New York. He gets to see what's going on. He scribbles notes down in Latin, and then stuffs these papers in his shoes. When he's coming back, we don't know exactly how he was caught, but there's some reason to believe that when he was on Long Island, ready to head back across the Sound to Norwalk, was where he was heading, he encountered a guy named Robert Rogers, who was this unsavory character who had fought on the British side in the French and Indian War, and then was like trying to decide which side to take in the American Revolution, ends up on the British side, and he's on Long Island recruiting people to fight for the British. And one version of the story is he tricked Nathan Hale into, Rogers pretended that he was also spying for the Americans, and Hale apparently said, oh, so am I, and blew his cover. And then Rogers turns him over to the British back on Manhattan.
Of course. Well, that seems to cover the martyr section of the title of the book. Now, what about the traitor?
Well, I have to confess, Moses Dunbar is kind of my favorite, in part because nobody knows much about him, but he's the reason why this book even exists. And if I can give my own little backstory here, I was an undergraduate at UConn. And when I was a junior, I was in a course on the American Revolution. We had to write papers, and I decided I was going to write a paper on loyalism in the American Revolution. And I was looking at laws against loyalists. And in all the stuff I was reading, there were always these little footnotes that said, Moses Dunbar, only Connecticut colonist convicted by a civil court of treason against the state and executed. And that stuck in my head. I kept thinking, well, why is he the only one? And I, hate to say that it took 45 years for me to get around to writing the book that answered this, but he's the son of a Connecticut farmer. His background is not massively different from Nathan Hale's. I mean, the Dunbar family is poorer. He grows up in Waterbury. And so there's nothing to suggest right at the moment of birth. He's also 9 years older than Nathan Hale, but there's nothing to suggest that, oh, this guy's born to be a patriot, this one's born to be a loyalist. But what happens in Dunbar's life is he has to get married when he's 17 because his bride-to-be is expecting a child. And shortly after that, he converts to the Church of England, which in Connecticut at this time, there were a number of Anglican churches, Anglican parishes. In fact, the largest concentration of them was in Southwest Connecticut near Westport and places like that. So it wasn't that there were no Anglicans in Connecticut, but there weren't many. And his father, John Dunbar, was a very fervent Congregationalist. And so Moses is alienated from his father because of this religious choice, which he makes for religious reasons. In 1764 is when he converts. But then as the revolutionary crisis heats up, people in Connecticut, particularly Congregationalists in Connecticut, become very suspicious of Anglicans. The head of the Anglican Church is the King of England. And they assume that all Anglicans are fervently on Britain's side. Not all of them were. Some of them were, but not all of them. And so this religious identity becomes politicized. Now, it's true Dunbar spoke out in favor of Britain, which is maybe not the smartest thing for him to do. But also, in the few statements we have from him, what seemed to bother him was the violence of the Patriot protest. He says at one point something about he doesn't think the differences with Britain are worth shedding blood over. but his own blood is shed because patriot mobs begin to beat him up. Other members of his Anglican congregation, he actually is in a congregation just over the border from Waterbury in Farmington, Connecticut. And, this is a part of the revolutionary story we don't usually hear about, patriot mobs beating up those supporting Britain. When the war begins, and particularly when Britain takes New York, the same battle that sparks Nathan Hale's spy mission, Dunbar decides Waterbury is no place for him to live. He's not safe, his family's not safe. So he goes to Long Island. And in fact, he crosses over in September of 1776, the same month, I don't know the day, but the same month when Hale is going over. And he joins a loyalist regiment. And then he goes back to Connecticut because he is commissioned as a captain and he's got to go recruit more soldiers. So he goes back to Connecticut to recruit more soldiers. He goes back to his hometown and he's caught. And he's caught in late December of 1776. And everybody in Connecticut is petrified. The British are going to win and wreak all sorts of havoc on the Patriots. So he has tried for treason, and he did join a loyalist regiment, and there were then laws on the books in Connecticut saying this was treason. What Dunbar may not have known is there had been a whole series of laws against loyalists with escalating penalties. And the law that made joining a loyalist regiment a capital crime had been passed the previous October. So the law was only a couple of months old. So I don't know whether he knew this or not, but he is executed in March 19th, 1777. And he's the only one. Other people are accused and even convicted of treason, but they get out of execution in one way or another. He was like the scapegoat, the perfect scapegoat, the example. And part of that has to do with personal factors too. He's alienated from his family. They're not going to help him at all. Who's going to speak up for Moses Dunbar? He can't afford a lawyer. His only network that could support him are other Anglicans who are not. In fact, a number of members of his church are jailed after his execution. They eventually get out of jail, but everybody is petrified of what's going on. So that's his story.
And he's a fascinating story. It's amazing that he's largely unknown, at least through the public eye up until now. It's an amazing story. Now, so we heard a little bit more about why you were so interested in Dunbar, and he is rightfully so very interesting. But I think most people in Connecticut know of a more well-known spy of Benedict Arnold from Connecticut. What made you choose, and we heard a bit more about why you were so interested in Dunbar, but why did you choose to use Dunbar and Hale as the central characters of your book?
Partly, I mean, there's a lot written on Benedict Arnold. I'm not sure I could say anything new about him. But, what struck me about Dunbar and Hale, again, is it always sounds like a law firm to me, Dunbar and Hale, but that they're both farmers' sons. Again, slightly different socioeconomic status, slightly different in age, but there's nothing in their background that would predict which direction they would go in. And there's the sort of dramatic symmetry of their stories, that they both go to Long Island in September of 1776. And I didn't know this until I started working on the book. They both hang within are hanged within 6 months of each other. And also what they're doing in September of 1776 when Hale is hanged, in March of 1777 when Dunbar is, any betting man or betting person in Connecticut at this time would have said, I think the British are going to win. So they don't know how this war is going to turn out. They don't know how this revolution is going to turn out. So the choices they're making are based on the best available information, which is actually that the British are likely to win. And one of the things I suggest in the book is, had the British won, we might know a lot more and commemorate Moses Dunbar as the martyr and try to forget about Nathan Hale as the traitor. So it's this notion that historians are always talking about is contingency, the sort of unexpected set of events that create these historical episodes.
You mentioned the letters that are still around from Hale. What other primary sources were you able to document these two men's, ultimately these two ordinary, as you said, farmers' sons, but they lived these extraordinary lives that they're remembered for? What sources are there that tell us these stories?
Well, Hale has more documentation, even though he was only 21 when he died, in part because of his historical reputation. What was a huge help to me was in the first part of the 20th century, it was like the 1930s and 40s, there was a guy named George Dudley Seymour who was, I think he was a lawyer, but he also was just an antiquarian and collected documents and was fascinated with Nathan Hale. And he put together this, what he called the Documentary History of Nathan Hale, which was published, which had extracts from letters. Nathan Hale had a very brief army diary, interviews that were done with people who knew Hale, these interviews done in the early 19th century. He just put together all the stuff that he could find as of, I can't remember exactly, I think this was published in like 1943, 44, something like that. And then I went out to see what else was out there. There were new letters at Yale. A lot of the Hale stuff was at Yale. It was there that I found the Linonia Society minutes so that I could track what Nathan Hale was doing there. His brother Enoch, who was just a year older than him, who went to Yale with him, kept a diary, which is at Yale. So I worked with that material to sort of bulk it up. And it was always interesting to me because there are a lot of letters to Nathan Hale, not so many that at least historians can use by him. There's some, but I don't know whether those are still in private hands or what. But the fact that so many to Nathan Hale survive, I think, proves my point that he was hanging on to these letters from his friends so that when he couldn't see his friends, he could at least read their letters over and over and over again. So we have those materials for him. Dunbar is trickier because he never left home, so he had no reason to write letters. There are the court records of his legal case. The town records and church records for his community, tiny little, there are a couple of mentions of him, but not much because he was not particularly distinguished, young and poor. The key document for him was something that's often called the last speech of Moses Dunbar. It wasn't really a speech. It was a sort of statement he made. He almost certainly dictated it to somebody else to write down within a day or two of his execution. And the copy I worked with is the oldest known copy, and it's a copy that's at the Morgan Library in New York. I questioned them on where they got this. It looks to me like late 18th century handwriting, and they only knew the antiquarian they bought it from. So, but he starts out with, my name is, I was born, this is my father, with a lot of biographical stuff that I could verify. And then just sort of confirms his Anglican beliefs. He, claims that he was, unfairly tried. Some of the evidence against him was not, legitimate, but he died with a clear conscience. And so this is his only voice that I had, but it was a pretty eloquent one. And I did find, in a roundabout sort of way, a Massachusetts soldier who happened to be passing through Hartford, Connecticut when Dunbar was executed, who witnesses the execution. And he mentions that Dunbar made a speech and read from the book of Job. And that's all he said. I'm like, part of Job did he read? What did he say in his little speech? But I don't have that, but I always have thought that if we had those words, we might find them as sort of admirable a dying statement as Nathan Hale's.
Do you believe that Dunbar's documents are less likely to have survived because of his status as a traitor? Do you think there were more documents that may have been lost because of his status?
Not really, because he only shows up in history because of his court case. I tried to go through, I spent a lot of time at the Connecticut State Library at the archives, and I looked through New Haven County court cases to see, is this a guy who was always arguing with his neighbors and getting, so that they had a grudge against him? I couldn't find anything there. He's more like the ordinary colonial farmer who just doesn't leave documents behind. So yeah, I don't think I missed anything, but if anybody out near, listening to this knows of Dunbar documents that are out
there. If anyone has a secret stash, please let us know. We would love to read them.
Well, my other dream is that I think this would make a great miniseries, this book, but I have no idea how to do that. So anyway.
If there are any producers listening.
Yes. Very dramatic story, 2 hangings, it's.
Yeah. So obviously both Dunbar and Hale are white men. Much of the history that is coming out today is delving into minority and women's history. What do you hope audiences take away from these 2 men's story in Martyr and the Tailor?
Yeah. Again, it was sort of the story found me rather than me looking for the story. So it does focus on these 2 white men. Although I personally haven't done this, but I have friends who have taught The Martyr and the Traitor alongside another book called The Hanging of Thomas Jeremiah, which is about a free Black man in Charleston, South Carolina during the Revolution. He works as a harbor pilot in Charleston Harbor, and is suspected, probably wrongly, of helping the British. And he is tried, convicted of treason, and hanged. And so it's a kind of a interesting parallel story. And what it illustrates is how frightened people were at the time. Again, in the case of Connecticut, the British are right there in New York, and people are worried loyalists are going to help them. So, when I come away from this book as a whole, what I really want to do is complicate people's understanding of the Revolution. It's one of those events that people tend to see as, any right-thinking colonist would have supported the Americans. To sort of say, well, I think Moses Dunbar was a right-thinking colonist, but he could see his way to supporting the other side. And to remember that the Revolution divided communities, divided families. Nathan Hale had a cousin who supported the British. I don't know that there would have been many families where they couldn't, find somebody on the other side. And all this is going on in an atmosphere of fear, suspicion, polarization, something we're all too familiar with today. But despite all that, the people of good conscience could take one side or the other. And the other kind of takeaway from this is something you mentioned earlier about, gosh, nobody knows about Moses Dunbar. And it's a kind of old saying, but it's true. History is written by the winners. And it involves, the writing of history tends to involve forgetting certain things, even as it's remembering other things. And what I wanted to do is remind people about the loyalist, group in the American Revolution, to paint them as something other than evildoers, and to suggest that they're an important part of this story. Particularly, and I want to just emphasize this, in the case of Dunbar, he's obviously executed, most of our historical knowledge of loyalists focuses on those who fled the United States and went to Canada, went to Britain, went to the West Indies. And it's because there are these lists of these people and you can track them out and find them out. But most loyalists just stayed in America. Moses Dunbar's widow, his children, that, and part of this thing too is, how could they do that? How could they even, stay? I mean, they don't all stay in Connecticut, but how could they stay in the place where their father, husband, brother was persecuted, beaten up, and executed? And I think in the end, the notion of being an American, a member of a new nation, really early on was less important to these people than being members of communities, of family networks, of churches. And they didn't want to leave those local connections behind. So
that's very interesting, and that definitely backs up a lot of stories that we hear in Westport and the area's history. There are families in Westport. It wasn't Westport within the Revolution; it was Fairfield at the time. But there are families that we know of that were loyalists. That we know some of them fled to Nova Scotia. We know others that came back later. There was a man in Wilton who was killed because he was an accused loyalist. So that's definitely an attitude that was reinforced in our own communities during that time period.
Yeah, there were some local histories that said that Dunbar's widow went to Nova Scotia. And so I was all excited thinking I could take a research trip up to Nova Scotia, but not being able to afford that, I hired somebody to go through the local records, and there's no evidence whatsoever. And there's evidence of her back in Farmington, during the Revolution. So I don't know why she would have fled during the Revolution and come back during the Revolution. She actually married, it's sort of complicated, but Dunbar's first wife dies, he remarries, and then when he's executed, his young wife marries the brother of Moses Dunbar's first wife, the Jeromes of Farmington. And I think part of it is, she marries him somewhere around 1780. Only a kind of suspicious Anglican loyalist can find a spouse who's a suspicious Anglican loyalist. Nobody else is going to go near him. And also it was a way to find a husband and father to help take care of all the Dunbar children.
Is there any more mention of Dunbar's family trying to get any kind of retribution for him, or any kind of redemption for him, or for Hale as well?
Hale has been commemorated. It takes a while for that to happen because coming out of the Revolution, those who supported the Revolution were happy at the outcome, but it was thought that memorials to individuals, except maybe George Washington and one or two others, that was sort of like what monarchies do. It's not what republics do. So there was a real reluctance to make public monuments or anything like that. What happens though is, as you move into the early 19th century and the revolutionary generation, the veterans are dying off, there's suddenly this flurry of activity to get oral testimony from them and the beginnings of the erection of statues and so on. And that's when the obelisk in Coventry celebrating Nathan Hale, it's not until 1846, I believe. Takes a long time for that to happen. So, it takes a while, but he gets famous. Dunbar, as far as I know, there's nothing anybody's ever done, but I will say something which I found very interesting in working on this project is that over the years I've done it, I have been contacted by maybe a dozen or more Dunbar descendants who are just, I don't know how they found out I was working on this, but they wrote, and they would often say, I'm a descendant of Zena Dunbar, one of Moses's sons. And I just like the idea that somebody's writing about him. I don't care what you say about him, good or bad. It's just, I like that somebody's saying something about him. I've never heard from a Hale family member because I don't think they needed it. They have plenty of material on him. Although I don't think any of it quite has the take on him that I do, because their starting point is Hale the hero. They're not, the starting point is this baby boy born in Coventry in June of 1775.
That's very, very interesting that the Dunbar family is so excited to hear more about him, even though he has this kind of infamous status. It's really wonderful that they're getting a little bit of remembrance for their ancestor, even if he came down on ultimately the losing side of history.
Yeah,
that must be really, really wonderful for their family to have that history.
Yeah, and it's even, the book's been out for a couple of years, and even now, just not long ago, I got an email from somebody with some questions. So, it's kind of fun. If I can answer the questions, it's great.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. Do you have a particular area that you'd like people to pick up the book? I know that you mentioned bookshop.org, which is a local or a platform where you can buy the book through a local bookstore.
Right. I have been using that a lot lately because during the pandemic, a lot of bookstores had to close, and it's an alternative to Amazon. You can get it on Amazon. You can get it directly from Oxford University Press, but that with bookshop.org, you can pick a state and then designate in a town a bookstore. And here in Boulder, we have two independent bookstores, the Boulder bookstore and then a smaller one called Innisfree bookstore. And so I've urged my students in using course books to get things there so those shops can stay afloat until they can open fully again.
So we encourage you, if you are still with us, we encourage you to pick up the Martyr and the Traitor wherever books are sold, or to go on to bookshop.org and not only pick up the book, but to support some of these independent bookstores as well. If we have any other questions, please do enter them in the comments bar. Otherwise, thank you so much, Virginia, for joining me. Is there anything else you'd like to leave our audience with this evening before we sign off?
I don't think I have anything more to add. I would love people to read the book, even if you borrow it from your library. But it was sort of, it was like a, I hate the phrase passion project, but the fact that this story was simmering in the back of my mind for 40 years while I worked on other things, I'm glad I actually got it out. And it tells a story that I think needed to be told.
Well, thank you so much for joining us, everyone, and enjoy your weekend. Thank you so much. Have a great evening.
Thank you.